There's a rule of thumb with native worm season grasses and forage production that the first year is no forage production. The second year is 50%, maybe 70%. And the third year, you're off and running. This video addresses that second year. How do we graze it well? What do we expect? And what are we gonna see? So what is it in the second year that's happening with our plant? Let's take a look at that because it informs a lot of our management decisions. It informs how hard we're gonna graze, what we're gonna do. So in the second year, and this is the second year big blue stem field that we're standing in here, this plant is continuing to develop its root system. So year one, it starts out as a seedling and you have a shoot this big and a root this big. And then it develops this root system. They say that a big blue stem plant, if you stack the roots end to end, it could have a 25-mile root system, like all stretched out. I mean, that's crazy impressive. So, but it doesn't start that way, right? It starts with a little bitty root. So first year, we are developing that root system underneath, and it's the plants here that is supporting that root growth. The second year, we're continuing to develop that root system. Usually it's not fully developed by the end of the first year. And so we're continuing to develop that root system. So that's gonna inform a lot of our management as far as like, we wanna treat it nice. We wanna treat it a little bit with kid gloves. We wanna err on the side of caution would be another way of saying that. So as we explore the physiology of this plant, like how developed it is it ready to start grazing? Let's go back in time and explore this with Colt.
I want to show you two fields side by side. This is one establishment of OZ70 Big Blue Stem, and it's coming up on its first birthday, meaning we planted this last spring. So a big question we get is, what kind of grazing am I going to get out of my warm seasons here in the second year? So it's obviously too early to turn in yet, but we're up about, 12, 13 inches tall. The plants are not really big tillered. The bases are still big as a softball or so, but we're in the late April, first part of May. We have it frosted for about 2 weeks. We got this kind of growth on it. I would expect to get grazing out of this field at least 50 to 70% of a full established stand this year. Now we'll come back in about 2 to 3 weeks and we'll look at this again and see if it's time to turn cattle in yet or not. But at this point, it's still too small to turn cattle into. So we just could be using this information to plan ahead on our grazing activities to say that we're going to get some grazing out of it this year. Now, if we'll come right over here in the field next to it, and this is actually planted at the same time to the same OZ70 Big Blue Stem. The difference is this was the guy's hay field on the property. We bought this property and planted it. What I just showed you was a pasture, and this is where he hayed repeatedly. We established it the same, all that stuff. What you get in here is a lot smaller plants. There's a lot that are tillered and big as a softball. They're more like 8 inches tall. But if you look around beside me in patches, there's plants that are still single and double stem. They barely tillered out at all. Now those are not this year's seedlings. Those are from last year, but they're really being suppressed. There's a lot of weed competition in here from yellow foxtail and just poor overall soil health. So as I look at this and I make my grazing plan at this point in the spring, I would say I'd almost count this field out. Even though it's a second year of its growth, we're not going to have enough that we remove. We may do a little bit in August or so, but we're not going to definitely do much early. So if one, let's take a closer look at the two and talk about the tillering and the growth that I see. So this is on the stuff that I expect to graze this year. And you can see my hand there, we're probably even approaching 13, 14 inches tall. So like I say, this is 1 year old, planted a year ago in the spring, and we got really nice growth. And as coming off of this one tiller here, you've probably got 50 stems maybe, and it's fairly thick, dense stand. All of it's tillered out nice. There's absolutely no reason I wouldn't expect to get some grazing off of this. Let's go over here and look at the field where I don't expect to get such good grazing. So as you can see here in this old hayfield where it didn't establish as well, we have a nice plant density. There's one here, there's one here, there's one here, here. You know, there's a nice amount of plants, the same as what we was just looking at on the other side. The difference is the size of the plants and also the tillering that's going on with the plant. So, you know, here we're looking at plants that are struggling to be 4 inches tall. They're the same age as what we looked at before, 4 inches tall. You got some that are 6 inches. This one's actually got 4 tillers on it. But over there we had 50 tillers and maybe 13 inches of growth. Here you're looking at 4 to 6 inches and, you know, single leaves to 4 to 6 tillers. What you've got going here, you've got yellow foxtail. That's what this thatch is. That was what was growing here last year. These seedlings was competing with. I didn't have a chemical way to eliminate them. So you had all of this standing upright out here this tall, and it's just hard for it to get through. So it's mostly a canopy sunlight problem. I don't think it was that nutrient deficient. The guy that we bought the field from, he seemed to do quite a bit of fertilizing after he hayed. So, and when I look at the plants, I mean, you had yellow foxtail that tall. That's not a sign of poor nutrients. You know, that's a good sized plant. And when I look at the color, you know, you learn a lot by the weeds. These weeds that are growing, that biannual weeds for this spring, they're not stunted or discolored any. Plenty of nutrients, I'd say here. It just was a competition problem last fall, which shouldn't be an issue this year. So, you know, he's got the jump on it this year, and he's got the root system all the, you know, a seedling Big Blue would be lucky to be like that so far this spring. Well, he's got a way better start now than what that would have. So this stand is going to develop and come on. This was mostly, I would say, due to weed. Build up a weed seed in the soil, the yellow foxtail through the haying over the years and burying the ground in the early spring, leading to a lot of foxtail in the soil, which wasn't controlled with the panoramic we used. But regardless of how we got where we are, I don't think fertility is really the answer to fix it. The plants have a good color to them and they look like they're gonna grow robustly this year, but I don't suspect I would get any grazing out of these plants. They're just too small and we'd harm them too much. So it'd be best to stay off. Like I say, if you have a really good rainfall year or something, we might be able to come in here in July and August.
So now, after visiting Colt on May 1st, we're back here May 29th with the same plants in the same field. So what is it? Is this ready to graze? Let's look into that. When I look at this and I think about the rule of thumb that we want to leave a 12 to 14 inch stubble here this second growing season of material, I'm like, can we come in here and graze it and leave that level of material left on the ground? And so let's look at that. When I think about it, I am in, you know, grass that's well over knee high. Some of it's just knee high. Of course, if I stretch the blades up, they're pretty much up to pocket knife high. This over here is a little taller. But when I think about grass that is somewhere between knee and pocket knife high, can I graze that effectively? Because the cow is going to come in and take a certain size bite, right? She has no height meter. We can't control and say, oh, you can only take the top 2 inches, ma'am. It doesn't work like that, of course. So if we come in here and we turn the cows in, what is she going to do? And what she's going to do is wrap her tongue around this and pull it off. And so at first, if she wraps her tongue around this and pulls it off, she may get some of these ends of the stems too, but she's going to eat that on her first bite. There's probably 3 bites to this plant. So we go from a plant that's about this tall, let's say, to a plant that's about this tall, to a plant that's about this tall. And that's all a rough rule of thumb. But if we do that, if we just come in and take the first bite off of this, we can effectively leave a 14, 18 inch stubble height with no problem. So that tells me that this is a good sign. This is ready to start grazing because we can leave that stubble height. So we walked 30 yards from the place we were up there. This is an old hay field, and that has had an impact on the establishment. We planted it the same day, it's planted to the same big blue stem. Everything's alike except the past management of this field. This one is not ready to graze. And you also saw this in the May 1st video with Colt. So these grasses are a lot less tall. So, the tallest ones are gonna, be somewhere about knee high, but this is the big plant in the group. This one back here, like if I stretch him up, he kind of barely makes knee high. But these are way shorter. They're also, like, the canopy coverage of them is way less good. Up there, we had good canopy coverage. It was shading the ground almost everywhere. Down here, I can see ground everywhere. Okay, can we come in here, turn the cows in, and get a stubble height of 12, 14 inches left when we leave? No, we can't. So if the cow comes in and she takes hold of this grass here and grazes that off, we're down, best case scenario, we're probably 10 inches tall. If she took a little bit bigger bite, which she sure could have, we'd be probably down to 8. And some of the plants are even shorter than this. This is not ready to graze. May not be ready to graze this whole season. And while that's really disappointing when you're looking for the production of this, when you look at the production of the stuff we were just standing in, like, to have that vision of this is what we're going for, so I'm going to treat it nice this year, and I'm going to do something I really didn't have in my plans, may be the wiser thing to do in the end. Now, a good question to ask ourselves is, do we actually have a stand? Because, is the reason we don't have all the canopy coverage just because the plants are not here, because they're, thinner somehow? And that's not really the case. We have a good stand here. We want 1 plant every square foot. Or if we have a square yard, we want 9 plants in there. Might be a better way to kind of look at it, because it's not always evenly spaced, right? So we want basically a plant every square foot. If I look down, here's 1 plant, here's 1 plant, here's 1 plant, here's 1 plant. We have more than 1 plant per square foot. So we're really just fine on plant density. It's just that these are not as developed. So in other words, they need to develop their root system more than the plants up there did. And again, it's not because of anything we did, like as we were planting or anything like that. It's because of that past management. So we've decided that this planting, the second year planting, is ready to be grazed. We've got good canopy coverage, we've got good thickness of plants, we've got tall plants. So we can graze them and we can still leave a nice amount of leaf down there. So, okay, how do we go about grazing it? What level do we want to graze it to? Let's talk some of those details. 12 to 14 inches is often considered a good height to make sure you're leaving that much leaf and stem. And so when we do that, if we defoliate it more, basically we're requiring that plant to come back and pull from its root reserves. And we don't want to do that, especially on a second year planting. We want to err on the side of caution on year 2. Really, you can't go too wrong, because if you overdo it, just take and do less next time. Give it a longer rest period. But on this second year planting, let's try to be as careful as we can. Let's try to make sure we're monitoring that grazing. So, a couple ways to look at it. One is leave 12 to 14 inches of leaf and stem. The second way that people often think about it is to come in and take 1 bite. And it would have been a little more ideal probably, and this field's a little variable in height, so it kind of depends on where you're looking at it, but maybe if we were here a week or so earlier, when some of the plants were a little less tall, because you'll get more knockdown on some of these taller ones. But back to our concept, we want to make sure we leave some stubble. So what we're going to do is come in here, cow's going to come in, she's going to bite this off. She might go ahead and, she's a little more delicate than I am about this process, so she probably isn't going to get quite as much of this lower stem piece. She's probably going to mostly just pick this up. And so when she does that, we want to leave 12 to 14 inches. We want to make sure that when we're walking out here, we're something like cowboy boot high with our grasses. The other way to look at it is kind of the take half, leave half, or the 2 or 3 bites concept. And so if we're taking half, leaving half, basically you can see, get my plants back up here, that I took half of the plant and left half of the plant. Okay, good way to look at it. Harder to see, of course, when you've actually taken half of the plant. How tall was that plant? Now I can't remember. So you might, as you go into the field, try to mark where oh, these leaves are right up here on me. And so I'm gonna just mentally tell myself, yep, that would be cowboy, take half, leave half would be that cowboy boot high. And of course, making sure that when I'm leaving half, it's at least that 12 to 14 inches. Okay, the third way to look at this is the 3 bites concept. A lot of these plants, especially once they get tall enough to leave that 12 to 14 inch stubble height, have 3 bites in them. So if you've got a plant here, let's just get a stem, I guess. If we've got this plant here and the cow comes by, she's going to take 1 bite off, and then if she comes back, she takes a 2nd bite off, and then that 3rd bite, we sure don't want to take it off. But on a 2nd year planting, we'd really like to only take off this 1st bite on most of the plants across the field, and then move to the next paddock or the next field, or move somewhere else. So that's kind of 3 different ways you can look at grazing success. Leave 12 to 14 inches of stubble height, take 1 out of 3 bites off of the plant, so remove a 3rd, or take half and leave half. Another thing we need to ask ourselves on a 2nd year planting, and any planting really, is do we want to fertilize it? Some people do, some people don't. And that's a lot, I guess the factors that go into that decision are really, 1, your personal preference. Are you kind of regeneratively minded and you're like, nature can do it itself? Or are you like, fertilizer is a tool and I want to use it, see if I can get some more production out of it. The native warm season grasses don't respond as much to fertilizer, but there is some evidence to show that you can get some added production out of them with some fertilizer. You really can't go wrong either way unless you're haying. If you're going to hay, it is a good idea to replace what you're taking off. I am a pretty big proponent of that. We don't fertilize our native warm season grasses, but again, a lot of people choose to do that, and that's just fine.
There's a lot of discussion around this. There's a lot of different trains of thoughts. I'm not going to say that I got the best answer, but I'll tell you my experiences. Let's look at the stand of grass that we're in and the height of it. And so it's about time to start fertilizing if you're going to. The grass is up green, it's growing good. We're here at the 1st of May. This is a fairly young stand, so it's not going to really have canopied, but it's actively growing. It's time to put your fertilizer on. So if you're going to fertilize, now's the time. Now, here at Hamilton Native Outpost, we do a lot of grazing and seed production and not really a lot of hay. And my experimentation with fertilizer on big blue stem, little blue stem, and Indian grass says that it doesn't really matter much if I put NP or K on. I get about the same growth. I can make the weeds grow bigger in the field, but I really haven't been able to make the native grass grow bigger or get more tonnage. Now, that being said, if you're using a hay field or you feel like you're not getting adequate forage production, it could have to do with your soils and your nutrients, and maybe some fertilizer would be worth it. So we'll look at that. I will say, however, though, with eastern gamma grass, you do get quite a response from nitrogen in particular. Of course, you want to balance the P and K in there, but it does feed heavily on the nitrogen, and it does increase your tonnage yield quite a bit. And we'll go into more of that later. But mainly, if you're going to fertilize, it would be the time. If you're not going to fertilize, there's really nothing to do but wait and let it grow. Another train of thought is to go out there with a small bucket or fertilizer buggy, just do a band or 2. Figure out for yourself what the fertilizer is going to do to you, for you with your soils. I don't really see that when you do soil testing and whatnot, a lot of times it'll call for this or that. When I make those amendments, I don't get the response that I see to benefit it. Therefore, I don't do much. But I've heard testimonies and I've seen other people's experiences where they did. So I'm not wanting to put the idea of fertilizer down. I'm just wanting to say, why don't we do some testing as in actual application testing to see what it's going to do for us and whether it's worth doing that to offset the cost or not. Anyway, so we'll give you some of the thoughts and recommendations here on what other people recommend that you do with fertilizer.
If you're going to fertilize it, what is it we're looking to do? One, we'd like our pH to be in the 5.0 or higher range. We don't really want it, up above neutral either, but we're not looking for it to be too acidic. So there's one rule of thumb. Two, we'd like our phosphorus and potassium, phosphate and potash, levels to be in medium on the soil test report. And so to fertilize to get to that medium would be a goal if you're going to fertilize. And then third, to put on some nitrogen. So 40 to 60 pounds of nitrogen to the acre is a very common amount of nitrogen to put on. Now, if you're doing like eastern gamagrass, it will respond more to nitrogen than the other native warm season grasses. And again, you don't even have to fertilize the eastern gamagrass, any of them. But it is definitely a tool you can use should you want to. So you've got that decision to make. Again, you can't go too wrong. Do you want to fertilize part of it, not fertilize part of it, so you can start learning about whether you want to or not, or just go headlong for one direction or the next. It's your choice. So if you've decided to put the fertilizer on, when should we be doing that? This is a little late. So what we're looking for is when it's just beginning, the really active, aggressive growth of the warm season grasses would be the time to put that fertilizer on. And what that does, it puts it out there when the grass can make use of it right away. It's not dormant, it's not still half asleep, but then also it's not giving those weeds time to really get at that fertilizer and use it instead of our warm seasons. And if you put it on earlier, those weeds take advantage of it. And not to say that doesn't eventually get cycled back into the system, but it doesn't get cycled in very quick. So put it on when you're 12 inches tall, somewhere around that neighborhood, when you're just like really starting to crank on the growth of that would be the most ideal time. So in a second year planting, we also need to consider, do we need to do any weed control? And sometimes it's kind of optional. Sometimes you'd really be beneficial to do it. So let's look at that. We're here in this field, and this is the second year planting. We've got a lot of these weeds that are showing up in here, to the point that it's being quite a bit of competition for our plants. And as I look at this, I'm like, okay, here, there's actually a pretty good stand of the native grasses here, but this weed pressure is really gonna affect it here this year. So here's our small big blue stem plant. Here's another, here's yet another. So there's a lot of plants in this area, but some of them are small, and there's a lot of weed pressure in this area. So we've got a good stand, but because of the past management in the field and factors that we really can't control, this stand has not come on as quickly as, say, the stand right across the way over here that was done on the same day, planted on the same day, done in the same way. So in this area, we really need to consider weed control, because although these aren't that big, these buckhorn plantains are not that big, they are providing competition for our little developing grass plants. And what we really want to do, since we're in that second year, you want to do this in that first year too, is we want to give these plants every chance they have to get all of the sunlight, the moisture, and the nutrients so that they can grow that big root system that's 25 miles long. But of course, that doesn't happen under a lot of competition nearly as fast as it happens without that competition. Now, you may not want to use herbicides, and that's a choice you've got, but I want you to understand what happens if we do use herbicides and how this tool can help us if we choose to use them. So there's kind of two times when you're going to want to consider using some herbicides, or consider the weeds in the field and what you're going to do about them. Let's put it that way. One would be in winter, so in the dormant season. So we go out there when this field was brown, last year's growth was sticking up. We can look for the winter annual weeds, and we can say, are they really going to slow down the growth of our big blue stem when it greens up? Because those winter annual weeds are green first. Is it going to slow down the growth of this big blue stem? And if our answer is, yeah, it's pretty thick, there's a lot of Queen Anne's lace, a lot of cheatgrass, a lot of something in that neighborhood, then we can do a dormant spray before this comes up, before the big blue stem is green. We can do a dormant spray with a glyphosate product, so it won't hurt the grasses when they're dormant, it just hurts the green things. So that's one time that we want to consider weed control. That's months before now. The second time we want to consider weed control is here in mid-spring. And what we're looking for is to see if the weeds are now going to compete with these and slow the growth down during this late spring, early summer time frame. And so in this area, this is a second year planting. And what we've got is a bunch of buckhorn plantain, among other weeds out here too. Some of them are just winter annual weeds. There wasn't that many. We didn't worry about that earlier. But there's a bunch of buckhorn plantain. And while buckhorn plantain is not particularly big, it can draw a lot of the moisture and the nutrients away from our little developing plants. And so as I look at this field, if I'm just counting on the bigger plants, which these are not particularly big plants for second year plants, and again, that has to do with like past management. This was a hay field. Don't understand everything there. But if I'm just counting on these, my stand's a little thin. But there's a lot of littler plants out here that are just one stem plants that if I can free those up to grow and give them sunlight, moisture, and nutrients, I'm gonna have a more successful stand. So if I remove the buckhorn plantains, which in some areas are quite significant, it's basically a carpet of them out here, then I am in a better position to go ahead and let these seedlings develop. And I shouldn't necessarily call them seedlings, being a second year planting. This is that second time when I'm coming out to evaluate what is my weed pressure and what do I want to do about it.
The second year of growth is an exciting time. But even though the plants have had a major growth spurt, it's important to err on the side of caution. The plants are still in development. You can find more information on our YouTube channel or website, where we have a printable summary of this video which you can take with you into the field. For more information, visit HamiltonNativeOutpost.com.